Okay, good morning, everybody. Good morning, good morning. Welcome back, everybody, for the second day of this wonderful conference. I am just appearing here to say some thanks and also draw your attention to some wonderful things the McNeill Centre is going to be doing in the next couple of years that I hope that you'll want to participate in. First of all, I want to thank the conference team at Brown and of course Karen and all of her staff at the JCB. And I also want to thank the staff at the McNeill Centre, who you haven't seen because they've been working behind the scenes, I know, to help you organize all of your travel and accommodation, and they'll be very important in giving you your money back after you've. So I want to thank Wendy Kaufman and Amy Baxter Bellamy for all of their sort of administrative work behind the scenes, and I also want to thank Peter Olsen-Harbeck, our associate director, who is here and has also been instrumental in organizing the conference. I just also wanted to draw your attention, as I said, to a couple of things. This is part of the McNeill Centre's sort of 2026 anniversary, I guess, activities, ongoing anniversary activities. We also have other exciting things on the horizon that are not 2026 related, such as our conference next May, Where is Early America? And so you might have seen that call for papers come through your inbox. The deadline is August the 1st for this. This is like a general sort of discussion about early American studies. So if you did see that, go back to it, put in a proposal. We'd love to see you at the McNeill Centre pretty much this time next year, or at the beginning of May next year. There'll also be a panel sponsored by the Society of Early Americanists, because this is, of course, it will be an Early American Studies conference in the interdisciplinary spirit of the McNeill Centre. For 2026, we'll also be having a sort of special edition of our Benjamin Franklin lecture series, which is kicking off in the fall with David Wardstryker, and of course everybody is welcome to come and hear his series of lectures. These new lectures are possible with a new endowment that we've got from the Meyerson family, and they're going to be a series of 3 lectures in a week that will then be published as a short book by Penn Press. And so this fall we have David Wardstryker, and I think I can safely say that next fall we've got Gwendolyn Du Bois Shaw, the art historian at Penn, who is going to be giving the lectures. I cannot yet reveal who our 2026 speaker is, but it's exciting. So, then the final set of things that I wanted to talk about, that's not everything we're doing, but I don't want to go on too long, is I wanted to highlight the Revolutionary City project that the McNeill Centre is part of with KISLAC, and in fact, the American Philosophical Society that David represents. It is at heart an online resource of primary source materials of documents that come from all institutions around the city. And the McNeill Centre, of course, is not a repository, but our role is also important. We're going to be hosting conferences that connect up with exhibits at the KISLAC Centre. And so in the spring of 2026, we'll be hosting a conference on Haiti that will connect with an exhibition of materials in the KISLAC Centre on the Haitian Revolution. And we've, in fact, been talking to Karen about how we can make these 2 conferences work together. So look out for that. And that is my cue, really, to hand over to Sean, who definitely also has some thanks to say as well.
Thank you, Emma. Thank you, Karen, and I'll echo you in thanking the staff of both the JCB and the McNeil Center, but also our staff at the Kislak Center. Two of our curators are here today, John and Lynn. Emma kind of just sort of touched the tip of the iceberg in terms of some of our 2026 planning that we've been working on together and in cooperation with the American Philosophical Society and other institutions in the city. I'll just say a kind of very brief word about those exhibitions, and it so happens that John and Lynn are charged with carrying them forward. But the first actually will focus. It's titled "Revolution at Penn?" And so it's intended to look at the at Penn during the Revolution, but also through the lens of course, sort of recent and contemporary debates around social justice and activism and the role of the university in those conversations. And then the second one really looks at both the French and Haitian revolutions through the lens of the McClure collection at Penn, and that both will be sort of points of reference for programming and conferences. And we are, of course, contributing content to the Revolutionary City portal. I kind of like the way that the two exhibitions sort of complement one another, one sort of looking inward at Philadelphia, and the other one, which is in dialogue with the major exhibition at the Museum of the American Revolution, looking kind of outward across time and space, and the impact of the Declaration. So thank you all for joining us these past few days. I've found them to be extremely generative as I think about these programs in 2026, but also about my role as the leader of a research library, and about how the decisions that we make about what to collect and how to describe it bear on historical scholarship. This morning, we're going to talk about how collectors shape archives. Many of you will be familiar with Nicholas Basbane's 1995 monograph, A Gentle Madness, which examines book collecting from Alexander the Great to Charles Blockson, whose collection of African Americana now resides in Philadelphia at Temple University. Some of you may know that Basbane took the title of his book from Benjamin Thomas's characterization of his grandfather, Isaiah, who he described as suffering from, quote, the gentlest of infirmities. We heard a bit about Isaiah yesterday and the institution he helped to found, the American Antiquarian Society. In my experience, collecting is not always gentle, and to describe it as madness would be to elide the core proposition of today's panel. The act of collecting is rarely, if ever, chaotic, that is, without rhyme or reason. Rather, it's a product of intentional, often very explicitly political thought. So if there's one thing that connects Saul Feinstone, Moncure Conway, and Thomas Addis Emmet, it's that they had explicitly political agendas in mind as they assembled their own archives of revolution. Yesterday, my librarian colleagues used the term artificial collection on several occasions, and I think in this mixed company, the term warrants some unpacking. You may have detected a subtle note of derision in that characterization, and you wouldn't be wrong. That's because an artificial collection is not an archive, at least as an archivist would use the term, but rather an assemblage of objects that have been torn from the context of their creation and then reassembled. In many cases, provenance and chain of custody have been erased, only to be reconstituted in idiosyncratic ways by the collector. As a result, we lose the ability to ask particular questions about objects, even as we gain the ability to ask new ones about the person who collected them. I'll illustrate this with one quick example from Penn's Arnold and Deanne Kaplan Early American Judaica collection. The collection includes a letter written in Hebrew from 1777 from Aaron Kagan, a rabbinical emissary from Amsterdam, to a colleague in America. That letter will, by the way, wind up in the Revolutionary City portal very soon. I don't read Hebrew, but a combination of the archival metadata used to describe it and ChatGPT. Thank you, by the way, whoever yesterday mentioned that you could upload an image to ChatGPT. That was pretty cool. Although the translation was not particularly helpful. But that tells me that the letter is really, it actually references a Central Asian community of Bukharan Jews Because I know Arnie Kaplan, I can tell you that he collected it because he collects all evidence of Jewish life in early America, and that he placed his collection with us because the library at the Katz Center is a stone's throw from Independence Hall, ground zero, if you will, for America's founding. What's missing, however, is any understanding of who Aaron Kagan was, what else he might have done, and how this letter fit into the broader context of his epistolary efforts. And so while we lose context on Aaron Kagan, we actually gain it on Arnie Kaplan. And such is the nature of the artificial collection and the topic of our panel. So without further ado, I will turn things over to our presenters. We're going to go in alphabetical order by surname, and two of our presenters are online. I'm imagining you're looking at them on screens. I can't see, but hopefully will be soon. But first, we're going to start with David Gary, who's here in person. David is the Associate Director of Collections at the American Philosophical Society's Library and Museum, where he manages a team that acquires, processes, conserves, and makes accessible the archival and printed materials of the APS. He was previously the Curator of Printed Materials at APS and the Kaplanoff Librarian for American History at Yale. He has a PhD in American History from the CUNY Graduate Center and an MLS from CUNY Queens College. He is currently working on a biography of the early American politician and diplomat Rufus King. Over to you, David.
Thanks, Sean. Thanks, everyone here. I wanted to thank the organizers and all the people who have made this conference possible on the back end, so I know how much work that is. We all appreciate it. And I also appreciate the experience of being here because I've wanted to look into Saul Feinstone's deeper history for a long time, and this has been a great excuse to dig into the materials that we have at the EPS, so I'm really excited about this paper. So today I'll be talking about Saul Feinstone and his efforts as a collector of American Revolutionary materials and the founder of the David Library of the American Revolution in 1959. It's possibly the only library in American history that exclusively focused on the American Revolution. At the time of his death in 1980, Feinstone had donated archival materials to at least 8 institutions. He founded 5 other libraries and 5 library rooms at other institutions. He endowed 5 different lecture series all over the country, and he established dozens of student prizes and funded over 1,000 awards to volunteers who helped preserve natural resources. Saul Feinstone was very much into forestry, as you'll hear, so that's why he was giving those awards. So I'm sure many of you worked at the David Library when it was at Washington's Crossing, and some of you may have accessed the material at the American Philosophical Society, where the collection now resides. The institution still exists as the David Center for the American Revolution in partnership with the APS. I was tasked with overseeing the move of the collection materials to Philadelphia in 2019-2020. They arrived 1 week before the pandemic. It was a very stressful time. And I've worked extensively in their support ever since. So with this new partnership solidified, I think it's a good time to take stock of the past as the David Center moves forward into a new era. Feinstone's collecting of original archival documents from the American Revolution and his founding of the David Library were first and foremost political acts. The collection I helped move was the outgrowth of Feinstone's American patriotism, sense of Jewish precarity and pride, Cold War anti-communism, and immigrant zeal. Feinstone was a man of conservative beliefs who identified as, quote, a Pennsylvania farmer and, quote, nonpartisan, although he announced his votes for both Democratic and Republican presidents, all of whom he complained did not live up to his anti-communist standards. He vigorously promoted military strength, the need to know our overseas enemies better, and strong leadership. But on the other hand, he had leftist proclivities from his early days in the United States, claiming to have been a democratic socialist of the Norman Thomas vein. Norman Thomas famously was the perennial socialist candidate for president for many years in the mid-century. Feinstone expressed a desire to end poverty in America, tax the rich more, implement a special tax on inflationary gain, and he promoted immigrant contributions to American life. Feinstone funneled these contradictions into a library like no other. He gathered a highly valuable manuscript collection of around 2,500 items related to the American Revolution. And toward the end of his life, in the 1970s, He said dealers claimed they could sell the collection for $2 million. He said this in one interview. And the next interview, a week later, he said $3 million. Saul liked to tell big stories. I ran those numbers through different aggregators and different inflation tools. It said maybe between 11 and $14 million in today's money. Definitely a high end, but you see where Saul's sort of coming from here. But I'm going to argue that those documents, essentially an autograph collection or an artificial collection, were ultimately less important to the advancement of learning about the American Revolution. It was really the immense microfilm and book collections of the David Library that were acquired in the mid-1970s forward that did the greater amount of work. That being said, the documents in the Saul Feinstein collection of the American Revolution were and are outstanding. It holds about 260 letters by George Washington and 40 more written to him, 65 letters by Thomas Jefferson, 40 by the Marquis de Lafayette, and 10 to 20 each from John Adams, Nathaniel Greene, Henry Knox, and James Madison. So I'll give you a few examples just to give you a sense of the quality of what he was doing. So this first one is a letter from George Washington, of course. It was Saul Feinstein's hero, to Henry Knox, dated March 8th, 1787. This is a very famous letter where George Washington asks for advice to attend the Constitutional Convention. I just pulled out a small quote. He notes, George Washington said this, "It is among the evils, and perhaps is not the smallest, of democratical governments that the people must feel before they will see. And when this happens, they are roused to action. Hence it is that this form of government is so slow." This is one book from Saul Feinstein collection. So Saul was much more of a manuscript collector, but he did have about 225 rare books in his collection, about 150 rare pamphlets. It's not immense, but it is pretty good. And one of the volumes here is especially good. This is John Hancock's copy of Volume 8 of the works of Shakespeare with Romeo and Juliet as the first play, published in London, 1752. No doubt Feinstein bought this item for the Hancock signature, but scholars today might gravitate to the later provenance of three women who are referenced on these pages. Mrs. Dr. Hodges, Sally Foster Otis, signing it as Mrs. Harrison Gray Otis, and Julia Marlowe. So Sally Foster Otis, the wife of the politician, merchant, and orator Harrison Gray Otis, was known for her wit, which I think she seems to be expressing here with this echo of a bold Hancock signature. So she also received this book from her former neighbor, Mrs. Dr. Hodges. The Hodges family is very large. I was unable to sort of pinpoint exactly who the person is referenced here, but I'm sure I'll figure it out at some point. And then lastly, there's Julia Marlowe, the famous actress known for her Shakespeare roles, who acquired this book in 1895, the year she debuted on Broadway, and started making substantial money, making this a possible early purchase right after her initial success. I think is a pretty neat book. And then lastly, we are still collecting materials for the Saul Feinstein collection today. So there's an endowment that is spun off from the larger endowment for acquisitions, which I manage. And I purchased this item from a dealer several months ago. It's a contemporary manuscript of a declaration of citizens of the Falmouth District of Maine in Massachusetts on June 1st, 1775. It is a very angry declaration, and on the back, a later hand wrote that we made this declaration and had everybody sign it in order to prove who our enemies were. So there's a lot going on with this piece, especially right around here with 2026. This was so inflammatory that Falmouth was burned 4 months after this document was made. All right, so now that we've talked a little bit about the manuscripts and you got a sense of the collection, let's turn to the collector himself, Saul Feinstein. So Feinstein was born in the Tsarist Russian Empire in 1888 in the town of Lida, which is now in western Belarus. He was the son of a Jewish scribe who also sold books from his house, giving Feinstein an early introduction to the life of the mind and the gathering of texts. After the death of his mother at the age of 12 and the arrival of a difficult stepmother, he spent time with his mother's family on the East Prussian-Russian border and with his uncle in Vilnius, Lithuania, and eventually emigrated to the United States at the age of 14 in 1902. Arriving in New York in true Horatio Alger style, with one penny to his name, he lived in the Lower East Side and worked in the city's garment industry, where he adopted socialist politics and organized unions. He had very little formal education, but he did take night classes and attended lectures, several of which were on the preservation of America's wilderness by Theodore Roosevelt and Gifford Pinchot, that inspired him to attend the University of Missouri and Syracuse University to study forestry. When he was told he would not get recommendations for forestry jobs at the end of his degree, the unstated reason being that he was Jewish, Feinstein picked up chemistry and taught for a couple years at Syracuse. Here he is in his 1915 graduation photo. He's the person in the middle on the first row. He eventually began working as a chemist at the Philadelphia Navy Yard and also published what might be the first chemistry textbook in Yiddish. In the early 1920s, after a disagreement with a supervisor, Feinstein left chemistry behind and worked in the construction industry. And after a few years there, he moved into real estate and stock investments, and he made a modest fortune during the Depression. He was always very vague about how he made his money. People often thought he might have done it in unscrupulous ways. He said no. He said, I got my money. I've got some money for which I did not have to work, but I borrowed dear money and paid it off with cheap money. I never considered it my money. It belonged to the people, and I began to build libraries with it. Essentially what he was doing was buying buildings and real estate for and buying real estate and then paying it off over years where inflation was happening, and then it was worth more. He was paying less for it at the end after the many years of the mortgage. And then sold properties. He managed them very well and made money on those properties as he was paying off the mortgages. So while he started collecting manuscripts in a variety of fields in the 1920s to the mid-1940s, he eventually settled almost exclusively on the American Revolution, with an emphasis on George Washington starting around 1945. His laser focus on documents and books related to the American Revolution makes him different from other Americana collectors like William Clements, Henry Huntington, Lloyd Smith, Malcolm Forbes, Richard Gilder, Louis Lehrman, all of whom collected really rich revolutionary collections, but also collected in a much broader swath of American history. They also had higher national profiles and greater wealth than Feinstein did. So Feinstein was a collector on a smaller level, but one who played a long game and gathered his respected collection, his collection of a few documents at a time over 35 years. That's how he got the 2,500. He did have some clout in the rare materials trade. One auction house owner changed the way he sold George Washington documents solely because of Feinstein, who at 88 had a proclivity to fall asleep during bidding. So instead of offering Washington documents under W in the catalog, the auction house folded it under American Revolution, and then it was under A, and Feinstein stayed awake, and the prices went up. Pretty funny story. All right, so why did Saul do what he did? So why did the person collect? One of the key questions for any collections history. Feinstein's interpretation of the American Revolution changed over the course of his self-education in the 1920s and his reaction to political events in the 1930s. At first, he believed in the economic interpretation of the progressive school, and then by 1935, likely because of the rise of Hitler and Stalin, he rejected the progressive school and argued the revolution was, quote, mainly political, whatever that means. He argued the Crown and Parliament would have found a way to resolve economic differences, but would not compromise on freedom, turning this struggle into something bigger, a spiritual fight for free men trying to remain free, which is his tagline for the next 35 years of his life. The philosophical goal of individual freedom, by which he meant self-realization in a free society, or a battle against, quote, sameness, became the core of Feinstein's notion of the revolution. He saw the revolution as a local and domestic affair with the goal of building a new nation at home that would be an inspiration to the rest of the world. Its leaders, George Washington and the other founders, he argued, were civilized Judeo-Christian men who believed in the Enlightenment and wanted national self-determination, all very positive interpretations of the revolution. Feinstein then argued that the founders understood this self-determination could only be sustained by inviting others, really Europeans, who cared about individual freedom to the United States, which, quote, brought to the new nation more than 30 million immigrants who helped build our country in freedom. The 30 million number is something he used throughout his PR days from the 40s to the 70s. In the 1970s, he would pay for the creation of a documentary, The 30 Million, produced by his actor and director son, Ezra Stone, who was a famous radio actor as well as a Broadway actor. And The 30 Million was broadcast on television and played in an audiovisual room in the David Library. Feinstein also sponsored at least 3 other films shown in the library, in addition to a filmed interview he gave about the Russian and the American revolutions. Feinstein also had these films shipped around the country for school children to view. We have a really great box from when I pulled the materials out of the basement at Buckstone Farms. There was the initial, the packaging said it was going to a school in California, so it's pretty amazing what he was trying to do. So Over the last decades of his life, Saul proudly and continuously proclaimed that he was one of those 30 million, making him a participant in what he saw as the revolution that was ongoing. So in Feinstone's worldview, the 18th century challenge to freedom paled in comparison to the continuing American Revolution's ideological enemies after World War II. International communism, led by a Soviet Union that would do anything to win the emerging Cold War. He made black and white distinctions between these revolutions. Feinstein understood the Russian Revolution as mainly social, as men sought to change the economic, legal, and spiritual conditions of the people. Its goals were universal, and its leaders sought to change the entire world and make it the same, the ultimate sin in Feinstein's eyes. Lenin, Stalin, and their supporters were, quote, they grew up in an atmosphere of subjection, desperation, and hate, end quote, that warped their worldview. He believed the Soviets would justify any means to achieve their immoral ends, and he saw a clash of civilizations occurring, and he understood his role to be a crusader of the American Revolution to an apathetic public. That's how he would support the American Cold War, or the Americans in the Cold War. So he would build libraries and expand his collection of original manuscripts and use them as propaganda, that is his word, for freedom. Even though he was a religious agnostic, he took up the evangelist's burden and worked to make his sacred texts, 18th century American manuscripts, available as widely as possible. He wanted to, quote, save the written word for our heritage. And he also claimed he did what other collectors did not do. As I acquire the manuscripts, I make them immediately available for scholars for new publications dealing with the revolution. I'm also using pertinent items as propaganda for a free world, end quote. So some historical context for Feinstein's desire to collect and his promotion of original sources will help us understand his inclination to share, educate, and persuade. This includes the Nazi book burnings of the 1930s and the much larger methodical theft of millions of books owned by Jews, communists, Freemasons, queer activists, Catholics, and many others deemed traitors by the Nazis. He understood how quickly the truth could be taken away. His idea of using personal archival collections to promote freedom and democracy in a world of two superpowers could have emerged from various other sort of efforts in the 1940s and 50s. First, he likely took inspiration from the modern founding papers projects, starting with Jefferson's papers in 1940. Feinstein's own papers have all sorts of correspondence with not just the Jefferson papers, but all the other founders' papers as well. He was a little bit different, though. He did not have government funding or support, and he never wanted it. And his scale, of course, was much smaller and personal. So Feinstein's efforts also echoed the cultural zeitgeist of the use of print when he began to seriously collect revolutionary documents. First, there's the Farmington Plan of 1942 to 1972. This was a cooperative project that grew out of the lack of access to international research publications at the start of World War II. Librarians selected items and worked with agents overseas to get materials shipped to American libraries. Another one was the building of libraries and restocking of books with the United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization, or UNESCO, as you probably know it, which sought to, quote, promote peace and social and spiritual welfare by working through the minds of men. The Franklin Book Program was an American nonprofit in operation from 1952 to 1978. It had a similar mission to promote the life of the mind by creating, producing, distributing, and using books overseas. The program translated books from English into 15 languages in the hopes of building local book industries. So other than the Founders Papers projects, Feinstein doesn't mention any of those programs, but it is sort of just part of the sort of general Cold War strategy being used by a variety of groups at the time. So in 1945, Feinstein is semi-retired. He moves to Buckstone Farm in Washington's Crossing, just north of Philadelphia. He was so excited about when he got this property, and he was so excited to live near George Washington's one of his major successes, that when he arrived at the farm, he refused to get out of the car. He told the real estate agent to turn around, go back to Philadelphia, and write up the paperwork right then and there. He said if he looked in the buildings, he would find some reason to say no, and he wanted it more than anything. So that's what happened. They drove back to Philadelphia, he signed the paperwork, and he bought the farm. For the next 35 years, he'd reside there and attempt to have his sacred texts of the revolution used by the public to inspire the resistance to communism. So Feinstein didn't leave very many sources about his semi-retirement in the 40s and the 50s. It's obvious he's challenging, part of this is about challenging communism as a central motive. But I speculate that the other looming event that motivated Feinstein's collecting was the Holocaust. In fact, his collecting, an attempt to preserve the memory of the revolution's lofty goals, seems even more important when seen through this lens, making Saul Feinstein's archive a Jewish archive. So as far as I've been able to tell, Feinstein never talked about the fate of his family in Eastern Europe. His mother and father died before the war, But he mentions many family members in newspaper interviews, autobiographical writings, and oral history. But he never discusses their fate. So I'll talk a little bit about the sort of context for what might have happened. The three primary places that Feinstein references are Lida, his hometown, Augustów, currently in Poland, and Vilnius, Lithuania. So the Nazis murdered almost the entire Jewish population of each city. Just to give you a reminder where these places are. So we're talking the confluence of Poland and Belarus today. So Lida, Feinstein's hometown, had a Jewish population of 6,300 people, a Jewish population of 6,300 in 1931, comprising about a third of the town's population. After the Nazi invasion of the Soviet Union, a ghetto was created in September 1941, and the Jews from the surrounding region were brought there over the next 2 years. In May 1942, almost 5,700 Jews were taken from the ghetto and shot. Another mass shooting of 2,000 Jews took place in March 1943, and the Nazis liquidated the ghetto in September 1943, sending 4,000 Jews to Majdanek death camp outside Lublin, Poland. Augustów, near today's confluence of Poland, Lithuania, Belarus, was where Feinstein's mother's family was. Feinstein had stayed there for a little while in 1900 and 1901 to avoid his stepmother, and about 4,000 Jews lived there in 1939. It was captured by the Nazis on the first day of the invasion of the Soviet Union. The Nazis quickly executed 1,000 Jews, and soon after consolidated control of the town. They formed a ghetto in October of 1941 and had it liquidated in June 1942. The Augustów Jews were sent to a camp about 25 miles to the west, where they were joined by other Jews the Nazis rounded up in the region. A group of 7,000 of them were sent to Auschwitz and Treblinka in August 1942, where almost all were killed. Vilnius, or Vilna, as Feinstein refers to it in his interviews, was where Saul worked at his uncle's bookstore for about a year before he went to America. The events of 1941 in Lithuania are very complicated, and just in sort of just because of time, I'm going to summarize it and note that about 90 to 95% of the Jewish population perished in Vilnius at the hands of the Nazis and the collaborators, mostly through the months of June to December 1941. So all the places of Feinstein's youth were systematically decimated. Each city successively managed by the heavy hands of the Tsars, the Soviets, the Nazis, and then the Soviets again. Feinstein explicitly states that he would have died in a Nazi or Siberian concentration camp if he hadn't gone to America. In the 1970s, he also said he never had a desire to go to those places after 1945, knowing that all the places of his youth were destroyed. Such oppression, violence, and hate were at the forefront of his mind when he examined history and bought documents. More than one person said Feinstein's sometimes incoherent political screeds were just Saul being Saul, but the gravity behind them, holding it all together, was this fear, which only grew as he got older. He claimed all the advances in science made authoritarianism more efficient and organized and led to a greater challenge for the freedom-loving West. So this fear consumed Feinstein and led him to buy documents. So the documents essentially gave him a soapbox to stand on. People paid attention to him because he had amazing documents, and he was willing to fund a variety of educational projects. He was a Jew preaching to the Christian choir, trying to shock the majority into action with their own heritage. So while the archival documents allowed him to evangelize about the terrible nature of communism and fascism, they did less work for the advancement of scholarship or public awareness of the revolution. The thing that did more work was the useful, if uninspiring, ribbons of celluloacetate and polyester. In other words, microfilm. So Joe Falcone was the librarian of the David Library in the mid-1970s. He noted that he had spoke with the historian and Jefferson Papers editor Julian Boyd about Feinstein at a board meeting they were both at. And Falcone told me that Boyd had said, "Saul uses his collection for political purposes," end quote, and that he wasn't a historian at all. So while scholars and editors like Boyd wanted to dip into Feinstein's documents for their specific needs, historians did not make the pilgrimage to Washington's Crossing to look at a handful of pertinent documents. And at that point, they were on deposit at the APS anyway, so they couldn't really look at them there. But what they did go to do is sift through the estimated 13 million to 15 million pages of documentation on 9,000 reels of microfilm, which are partially represented in the photo here. It's a big collection. And those are the original cases that were bought in the 70s as well. Still focusing on his hero, the big name historical figures, his hero, George Washington, and the big name historical figures of the Revolution, Feinstein was initially reluctant to fund this project. Falcone reported to me that he had to convince Feinstein that the David Library would not be relevant without the greater purchase of microfilament books. So Falcone said, "That was a tough fight, but eventually Saul gave in. I tried to explain to him that we can really make this a center of research on the American Revolution, but we can't compete with larger institutions. We're not Princeton University. But we can bring people here by buying all the microfilm." He said, "Basically, I bought everything that was available commercially on film. It was very expensive. So I counted all the different archives that are included in that. There's 50 archives represented in the purchasing he was making. No one else was doing this sort of highly specific, completist kind of microfilm collecting at the time. Falcone also pitched the idea of making the David Library its own National Historic Publications and Records Commission by funding the creation of microfilming relevant collections that were not microfilmed at the time. He argued that it would be best to be the only other place that had another copy of this, and that would bring more people to the David Library. Feinstein balked at that, though. He said it was too much and the logistics too hard. Forward here. So while the cost of bespoke microfilming certainly hasn't been solved with the APS and the David Center partnership, it's led to archival documents in microfilm being made more accessible. The Feinstein collection of the American Revolution has been digitized completely, and as has all of the microfilm. The former will be fully available in our digital library soon. About 600 documents are available now. We're doing there's a back-end sort of upgrade that needs to happen for the rest to get uploaded. That'll happen very, very soon. All the microfilm will soon be available at a station in the reading room, and the material from the Library of Congress and the National Archives, which represents about a third of the 9,000 reels, will be made available more widely on the internet. So this next step makes it easier to move beyond Feinstein's personal interests to delve into the lives of common soldiers, camp followers, enslaved persons, Native Americans, and others caught up in the events of the war. But we must remember that this archive sits on the foundation that emerged from the interests of a Jewish immigrant from Eastern Europe who feared the solace he had found in America would be taken away from him. And then I just wanted to end on this note. Saul kind of sent this to me as a nice moment to end the talk. So most of my collection, about 90% of it, is in Philadelphia right now at the American Philosophical Society being processed. That's a very important place, worth a visit. So I would agree with Saul, and I hope you all come to visit the Saul Feinstein collection in the future. Thank you.
Thank you, David. Next, we have presenting online Nina Slominski. She is an associate professor of history at Iona University, where she is also the director of the Institute for Thomas Paine Studies. She's the author of The Engine of Free Expression, Copywriting the State and Early America, forthcoming with the University of Pennsylvania Press. She's the co-editor of the forthcoming collection of American Revolution in the Digital Age, which we heard a bit about yesterday, with Cornell University Press, and published articles in the Law and History Review, Early American Studies, and New York History Journal. She's held a range of fellowships, including the Barbara Tom Postdoctoral Fellowship at the Huntington Library, and serves as the social media editor for the Journal of the Early Republic, amongst other roles with Scheer, the OAH, and Sharp. For more information about Nora and her work, you can visit her personal website, www.hamiltonsolo.com. Nina, are you with us on the screen? I see a face. So
hi, yeah, I'm here. And just to clarify, my name is Nora. Just in case there was any confusion with the program. Thank you all so much for being here today. I have a laundry list of thank yous to go through before I get started. First of all, thank you so much to the organizers, the JCB, the McNeil Center, the Kislak Center, and a special shout out to Jana, who's been absolutely wonderful with coordinating the hybrid component, which I'm very grateful for. So thank you so much. A few additional things. All the images that you see in the PowerPoint were taken by Leah Carpanzo and Rick Palladino, who are my colleagues at Iona University. So thank you to them for the photos, which would be infinitely less lovely if they were coming off of my iPhone. And I also need to thank Gary Burton, my former colleague at Iona, who is affiliated with the Thomas Paine National Historical Association, who provided me with several interviews and contextual knowledge for this talk. So thank you all very much. And just to give a little brief background, This is the first time I've ever actually spoken about this particular project in public. And what's very exciting about it to me is that this is a chance to really share with you all and get your feedback and insights, especially with so many wonderful librarians and curators in the room, on some of the work that we're doing at the ITPS. So I want to be super clear, this is not just my work. I'm speaking on behalf of a group of current and former colleagues who have all contributed to this. It's really the first time that I've been able to look at work other than my individual scholarship or work that relates to early America and digital humanities. In many ways, it harkens back to my master's thesis, which was a comparative analysis of Walter Lippmann and Alexander Hamilton, and really why people in the progressive era were so interested in early America. So this is a really great window. Okay, so with that, with those thank yous and that background, I'll get started. Prior to World War I, the Thomas Paine National Historical Association was really first and foremost a vibrant political organization. It was focused, not focused, on free thinker and other left-wing progressive era efforts. And it was involved in multiple campaigns around international affairs, labor, the arts, religious freedom, racial justice, women's rights, and other more specific policy points related to governance and social reform. Yet, despite the present day focus of the TPNHA, right, very much focused on its contemporary moment, right, it was in fact a historical association. And it was founded in the 1880s with a pretty explicit mission to, quote, commemorate and educate interested people about the life and legacy of Paine, who they viewed as this erstwhile revolutionary writer and activist. And they were very much inspired by Paine's involvement in the Age of Revolutions and his expression of numerous positions and values that they really understood to be the membership as both timeless and deeply relevant to their present moment. And in the process of this contemporary work, and when I say contemporary, right, their contemporary moment, they collected a vast archive related to both the American Revolution and what they saw as Paine's role in it. And this ranges from material objects like his personal effects, a writing kit, a pocket watch, a lock of his hair, uh, other items that were related to him personally, although not owned by him, such as creamware and coins that both commemorated and critiqued several of his high-profile publications and actions. And their archive also included books, pamphlets, newspapers, cartoons, maps, and other printed material. And what these hundreds and hundreds of items shared was a focus not only on Paine as a revolutionary thinker and communicator, but really demonstrated their efforts to understand the complexities of his legacies, but also of American independence throughout the Atlantic world. And another half of this collection, or second part of it, you might say, is the extensive records of the TPNHA itself. So in other words, you have this historical section to them and also their contemporary section, which is how they specifically sought to apply the knowledge contained in those 18th century items to the challenges of their late 19th century moment. Rather than seeing a contradiction in a historical association that actively connected the past and present, the TPNHA sought to mobilize their archival data to better inform the interests of the organization. And they really operated from a perception that Paine's public memory was incomplete and he was misunderstood or understudied. And the TPNHA then reasoned, and membership, well, I'll get to the membership in a little bit, reasoned that the American Revolution and the Age of Revolutions more broadly, particularly in many respects, the relationship that we would now discuss between Enlightenment and Empire, could really inform their challenges in the decades before World War I. And essentially, as the title indicates, right, what the organization believed that they were doing was assembling an archive for revolution, or perhaps more specifically, assembling an archive for what they saw as tools for change, right? They genuinely believed that these items, I'm still on the first slide, thank you, that these items would be helpful in their struggle, their pursuit of really transforming society in the decades before World War I. And something that I've been thinking about, and my hunch is that other folks in the room might be as well, is how the TPNHA viewed revolution in many respects as a process, right? Rather than a singular event, a war for independence, that it was this ongoing process, right, in the United States, and that the American War for Independence was very much a chapter in a much larger book, right, rather than a standalone event. And if you wouldn't mind changing the slides now, thank you. Great, thank you so much. And so to open us up, I guess, sort of as a highlighting vignette, and in all fairness, in a little bit of bias, this is one of my favorite items in the collection, but I do see this picture really functioning as sort of an artifact of revolution. And it's a small cream-work picture that both commemorates a specific historic event related to Paine and highlights how its movement across the Atlantic is very much in turn a highlight of what the TPNHA's goals were. The picture, and can everyone see the images okay? Okay, great, thank you. First and foremost, this picture is, thank you, yeah, is a form of social commentary on Paine's seditious libel trial in late 1792. And for those in the room who are broad 19th century scholars or familiar with this history probably better than I am, right? Defamation and libel is very much on the minds of people in the 1790s, and it's very much on the minds of people in the 1890s as well. And what this picture highlights is that is sort of an interpretation of Paine's libel lawyer, a man named Thomas Erskine, who argued the quote malice defense and right to an attorney on behalf of Thomas Paine, who had found himself tried in absentia for seditious libel against the English government in the 1790s. And just as a reminder for anyone in the room, I'm sure most folks are familiar with this, right? Libel, for something to be libelous, which is a written form of defamation, it has to be a falsehood, a lie, or not true. This was not the case in the late 18th century, where saying anything critical of government, even if that criticism was in fact factually accurate, could land you in prison or even worse. And for those, it might be a little difficult to read the quote on the front side of the picture, so I can read that off to you. And it says, quote, God save the king and all his subjects too, likewise his forces and commanders true. May their rights forever hence maintain against all strife occasioned by Tom Paine. Prithee, Tom Paine, why wilt thou meddling be in others' business which concerns not thee? For while thereon thou dost extend thy cares, thou dost at home neglect their own affairs. So it's pretty snarky, and pretty clear, the maker of this picture, where in fact they fall in terms of whether or not Thomas Paine is in fact a libelous writer. And just below that, it's in second quote, which says, observe the wicked and malicious man, projecting all the mischief that he can. And of course, much like Marie Antoinette on the other side of the English Channel, Thomas Paine's head is attached to the body of a serpent. So again, not subtle. And of course, a picture like this also, in addition to being a paraphernalia or swag item of the 1790s, also serves this practical or useful purpose. It's reproduced in Liverpool as part of the creamwear trade, and once again, sort of commemorates this political moment. How does this wind up then in New Rochelle in the 20-teens, which is when I first learned about it? It was acquired by the abolitionist Moncure Conway, and we have very limited provenance about exactly when he bought it and what his logic was for it. But we do know that it was purchased by him and then brought back to the United States. And I'm going to get into a little bit more about Conway in a moment. But essentially, based on the records that do survive, it's clear that Conway and his colleagues at the TPNHA understood a picture like this to relate to a view or a perception of Paine as a non-elite, that he was a more quote, accessible person in contrast with other founding era figures of the late 18th century. And there was almost a nostalgia for the fact that this is an artifact that could be of use in everyday life. And in fact, for decades, this picture was used as a pencil holder. In fact, yes. So it's sort of, yeah, was using it that way in real time. And now if you could just please switch to that next slide, please. Oh, thank you. So what does this picture have to say about the broader organization and about Moncure Conway himself? So the artifact, as I mentioned just briefly before, was almost certainly acquired by Conway, who was an abolitionist and free thinker, amongst an advocate for religious inclusivity. He was a creative writer. One of his most famous surviving short stories is about Excalibur. It's a Arthurian legend about how essentially Excalibur is removed from Camelot and then goes to the United States and is the sword carried by George Washington, who then gives it posthumously to John Brown. So he is very invested in the sort of imagery and imaginary, you might say, about what he views as a very central fight for justice in the 19th century. And after the Civil War, his activism shifts slightly into the politics of the day, but he becomes increasingly focused, in fact, on pain, especially by the 1890s. And that's when he writes a very lengthy, very detailed biography of him. He had traveled to London in the decades before, amidst the Civil War, for example. He travels to London frequently, where he's one of a member of a delegation that essentially is lobbying Britain to continue quote unquote supporting the Union over the Confederacy. And it seems that it's actually in the 1860s where he first acquires this picture. But he acquires several other items on these different trips. You can see some of them in the image in front of you. The aforementioned writing kit, Paine's personal trunk, his watch, multiple first editions and rare publications, a death mass, which why he would have acquired that in England when Paine actually lived the last years of his life in the United States, in New Rochelle, where Iona University is based. Once again, it's kind of a mystery of the provenance. But initially, Conway is focused very much on personal items, sort of items that directly relate to Paine himself. And then as the organization develops, grows, and I'll get to that momentarily, you begin to see an inclusion of the American Revolution more broadly, and then the age of revolutions more globally or internationally. Conway is one of the early joiners of the TPNHA. And he is pretty singularly responsible for its original collection. So this is sort of the tie into a collector specifically. But very quickly, in perhaps the spirit of the political orientation of the group, items begin to appear once again in the collection, or items are added to the collection that come from individual members. But the records do not often specifically state who that individual member is. So this is in many respects I guess, collective collecting that is a bit underway here. But the organization is incorporated, although it had been active in a more informal way in the years before, but it is incorporated on January 29th, 1884, January 29th being one of Paine's recorded birthdays, which essentially had a twofold mission. And once again, they see these missions as inextricable from each other, which is to encourage and expand knowledge about Paine. They really genuinely believe that he is sort of a quote forgotten founder, that the lack of attention to him explains several social ills of the period, from racism and misogyny to different specific policies related to those more broader phenomena that are underway. And the second mission, of course, is to use, I shouldn't say of course, but the second mission is to use that knowledge towards their present day iterations of the issues that they cared about. And this is directly from the minutes of the very first meeting, which states, quote, to perpetuate the memory and works of Thomas Paine, to obtain and disseminate accurate information about him, to refute the various slanders, that's when this defamation comes in, and fables that have been circulating concerning him, and to hold in perpetuity the Paine Monument at New Rochelle and piece of land on which the marble shaft stands. You can see from the beginning here that the lightning rod for the group was the Comstock Act of 1873. Thaddeus Wakeman was one of the most active founding members, and he was a Princeton professor whose politics were, at this point in the liberal wing to center, you might say, of the progressive movement. And I understand that in using that term, there is uh, that term itself requires considerable unpacking and attention that I'm not able to pay in the time today. But what is interesting here is that on this big tent of the organization, whether liberal or far left, saw pain as relevant to their ideological positioning. Um, and if you wouldn't mind just switching the next slide, please. Thank you. And so, as previously mentioned, this again tent of issues involved religious freedom. Many, if not the majority, of the founders identified as free thinkers. Freedom of expression um, was also deeply important to them. And in terms of their sort of specific on the ground ways of viewing those policies, you really saw them at the nexus of the labor movement, the suffrage movement, and anti-Jim Crow civil rights demonstrations and legislation. I guess you could really say that they were essentially an early iteration of what we would now in 2024 refer to as intersectionalism, right, of race, class, and gender. They were in some ways remarkably prescient in that way. They were especially focused once again on education, prison reform, suffrage, labor rights, and freedom of expression and religion. And they genuinely interpreted Paine in every one of those lenses. They believed that he was this guy who actually cared about all of those things in ways that were remarkably legible to them. So why Paine? In other words, right? I'm sure many folks in the room are relatively familiar with him, so I'll keep this brief. But Paine essentially, right, is born in the Mexico sort of working class, humble, modest means. Earlier in the 18th century, he immigrates to having worked as famously as a tax collector, amongst other professions, immigrates to Philadelphia on the eve of the Revolution, falls into the revolutionary circles. Franklin is an early mentor, amongst others, and quickly becomes absorbed into publishing and I guess today we would say almost communication circuits of, of revolutionary activists. Common Sense, of course, being one of the most famous texts of that period. You see a reemergence of Paine, or I shouldn't cut short shrift on this. I'm going to be mindful of time. Paine's star is in very dramatic ascendance in terms of popularity and prestige throughout the Revolutionary period. And in the wake of independence, he leaves the United States and spends considerable time in France, where he is eventually, as sort of legend has it, right, incarcerated. I should say legend. He is in fact incarcerated for and almost loses his life while under incarceration. His star begins to shift, right, in the wake of ratification of the Constitution, and certainly in the 1790s. In some ways due to political missteps of his own, and to others being that and I use this term, which is another term that really needs to be unpacked, I think, further, of course, but the quote radicalism of his political views being increasingly out of step with the political climate. And of course, Seth Butler has written about this so brilliantly, amongst others, politically out of step with the federal period and in the turn of the 19th century. And so he doesn't fade into complete obscurity by any means, but he is certainly less well known. And then by the 1820s, you do begin to see a very modest resurgence in interest about Paine. And in some ways, this dovetails or precludes. I'm thinking of the work of Al Young here, the shoemaker in the Tea Party, right, the 1830s and 1840s, as this renewed sort of popular interest. Michael Haddam's new book, right, renewed interest in sort of the memory of the revolution, especially in that period. But where you see him very specifically popping up, and I use this term carefully, but almost proto iterations of the labor movement. You see him. He appears in an 1820s pamphlet discussing kind of essentially what we describe as sort of unionization, right? Although I wouldn't use that exact term, but this is where he begins to appear. So it's not exactly surprising that this would be the demographic he'd be appealing to. There is also a turn or a perception of inaccuracy or misinformation about him that really peaks in the 1820s. This is really when you begin to see sort of counter biographies biographies that had initially been, you can see a few of these in the slide in front of you, um, responding to things like coins demonstrating him, as you can see, sort of calling for his death and really sort of highly critical both of his politics, but also of him. This is where you begin to see other kind of, we might say, he would consider defamatory attacks of his character and so on. This is also going to emerge amidst other preservationist efforts around the country, both historically informed and let's say uninformed commemorations that begin to start to crop up. Next slide, please. What becomes incredibly important early on to the TPNHA, unsurprisingly, is his written texts. And what you see in front of you are all copies that are in the collection. And of course, he has other works that are not included here. But what early finding aids of the collection, I'll speak more about that in just a few moments, indicate is that these are the 4 texts in particular that seem to be of the greatest interest to the organization, that the organization seems to be most essential for their quote archival revolution, right? The way in which they see the seeds of change that they want to evoke in the progressive era, they see stemming from Common Sense, Rights of Man, Age of Reason, and in many respects, Agrarian Justice perhaps most clearly highlights where they are looking and what they are looking towards in the 1890s and early 1900s. Common Sense, of course, being an early US bestseller, literary scholars and scholars of print have deliberated very thoughtfully the extent to which the sort of numbers of Common Sense's publication have upwards of 100,000 copies? Is it more? Is it less? But what we do know is that, of course, it was wildly successful, and his communication style was as much about the uniqueness of his ideas, a blend of the Enlightenment, the ancient world, spiritual and biblical analogy, as it was to the style in which he communicated, right? The accessibility and the way in which he wrote. There's also a unique for any copyright or IP interested folks in the room, the fact that he gives the copyright, which of course is more of an informal gesture because formal copyright does not yet exist, to the Continental Congress. And also gets himself embroiled into other printing disputes with Robert Bell and the Abbey Raynal, but that's for another presentation. The Rights of Man, once also really echoing in the TPNHA's mission with the advocacy for the right to remove a government without violence, though. The TPNHA does tell a very firm line about violence. The Age of Revolution, which was perhaps one of his most controversial pamphlets, the one that lands him in that defamation trial. And then Agrarian Justice, which was less famous in its time, but certainly deeply contemporary to the TPNHA, and oddly enough, has kind of had a bit of I wouldn't say revitalization, but for anyone who followed the New York City mayor campaign a few years ago, one of the candidates who did not get very far, but nonetheless got a fair amount of TV time, Andrew Yang, spoke at length about Agrarian Justice, came up quite a bit, which is an interesting thing to see. So to what end, right? What is fundamentally the interest of the TPNHA, both in its dual role as a preservationist organization or a commemorative organization, as well as a activist organization? And I think I want to just bring us back for a moment to this idea of the revolution as this ongoing process, and that these are very much tools for them to be actively using that in that way. If you could change the slides, please. So essentially, what role really does archival collecting play in the political or quote revolutionary outlook of the TPNHA? And I think the 3 ways it seems to, based on what we know about the collection thus far, is that it's essentially tied to education, communication, and reform. The increasing move to the left of the progressive movement occurs in the TPNHA over the course of its founding. So with the 1880s, with Conway and others, you see what I would describe as certainly left-leaning by the political spectrum of its time, but more in the, you might say, moderate wing of the progressive movement. But by the eve of World War I, and this is really where the organization is, that's the time period where it's at its most vibrant, and its membership is in the tens of thousands. It's quite quite large. You see a really sharp pivot in the leadership of the organization, and in many ways, two more, with few exceptions that are interesting exceptions that I'll get to momentarily, towards anarchists and socialists. Anarchism and socialism really makes up the bulk of the sort of political agenda of the organization, along with free thinkers. For example, Emma Goldman's attorney, Theodore Schroeder, was secretary of the organization for some time, and it's believed that he did contribute several items, but once again, we don't know which ones. Another example was Leonard Abbott, who was inspired by the Age of Reason, and Leonard Abbott was for many years the right hand, or one of the right hands of Eugene Debs, before he felt that socialism did not go far enough and moved into anarchist circles. You also had James Morton, whose personal friendship with W.E.B. Du Bois also facilitated contacts between the TPNHA and the NAACP. So there is this sort of political maneuvering across the spectrum here. There were also more moderate members. Thank you. William Vanderweyde, and for anyone in the room who comes from art history background, Vanderweyde was a very early professional photographer, and has his own collection or unique collection within the TPNHA. And just one of the images, and this one's actually at the NYPL, and I'll get to in just a moment why, is of Mark Twain on his deathbed, and that was taken by Vanderweyde. And then other sort of very well-known figures like Thomas Edison, the president, for a period as well. Ultimately, the split between the political ideologies often played out in organizational politics. And this is where you really begin to see this in the minutes too. And this then brings me as I wrap up here, to really next steps for the collection, and where again I would really welcome your thoughts and insights, and what I think this might tell us in this very preliminary stage about what does it mean to be an archive for revolution, right? And the first is, while the early American items have largely been photographed and digitized, and many of which have been included in databases like OCLC, right, things of that nature. And we do have a database that's at mile 24.5 from to 26 for going live and being accessible to researchers. It's really only the first half of the collection that has so far been digitized and incorporated into that database fully. And part of this has to do with our institutional needs, and so on and so forth. But we have not yet been able to embark on a large-scale digitization of the TPNHA records themselves, the minutes, really digging into the provenance, better uncovering where these items come from. And that's sort of our next steps. And this brings me again to the enduring question of interest. What was the motivation and rationale behind the TPNHA efforts? Which I've given you a very surface level view of what those look like, but I think this collection can also tell us a little bit about presentist projects and their historical context. What are the promises and pitfalls? Some key takeaways for me are accessibility, right? The sort of trying to mirror what Kane himself would have valued, the collection providing a common ground within a big tent for different political views, and how these collections can speak to numerous audiences and numerous historical and chronological periods as well. And what do we gain or lose by really considering the individual person as a foundation for broader goals or actions? And those are just some considerations I have as this project develops. And it would be wonderful if folks in the room or elsewhere were interested in coming and checking out the collection, and then we can embark on this project further. So thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Nina. Finally, we have Olga Sapina. Olga has been at the Huntington since 1998, before which she was the curator of the collection of the Russian 18th century printed and manuscript materials in the Division of Rare Books at Moscow University Library. She holds her PhD in history from the Moscow Lomonosov University, and her scholarly interests include comparative studies of religious enlightenment, the history of autographed manuscript collecting in the United States, and correspondence networks in British America. Her most recent exhibition at the Huntington was the U.S. Constitution and the End of American Slavery. Over to you, Olga.
Thank you so much. Can you hear me okay? Hello. I hope you can hear me because I can't tell. Thank you so much for the organizers of this wonderful conference, and especially to the valiant John Chavez, who battled my connectivity issues all morning. I'm honored to be here, even though two-dimensionally, for a variety of reasons. And just a brief preface, this is a work in progress. This is a part of a larger project on the history of autograph collecting in the United States. The decades before the founding fathers became the staple of American discourse in the early 1900s, the immortal signers of the Declaration of Independence were object of deep reverence. This reverence drove a significant section of photograph collecting in the 19th century. The nature of this worshipfulness is worth delving into. It was conditioned by a very complex mythology of the American exceptionalism, Anglo-Saxon values, as well as the universal transnational cult of the great man. There is the problem with collections assembled this way, that it presents a challenge of interpreting it, because a lot of our collections at the Huntington, the core collections, were assembled and retained by canon worshippers who were overwhelmingly white, well off, if not prosperous, privileged, and driven by the impulse to celebrate, as the original mission statement of the Huntington states, the progress of the English-speaking people. So this celebratory tenor is also undergirds the very nature of autograph collecting, because it's predicated on the value of literacy, and it's part of the culture that valorized writing and text as the ultimate expression of greatness. It's usually tied to American civil religion. However, the cult of the founders and the signers, like the trope of the city upon a hill, owes much to the lexis of the church. The language of the founding fathers was infused with patristic appeal of the fathers of the church. That agreement between the consistency and consensus as the measure of divine truth. And the signers were endowed with a collective sanctity that was rooted in the revealed truth that any agreement between humans was attainable only through the workings of divine providence. That would be Matthew 18:19. Whenever two of you shall agree on earth as touching anything, it shall be done by them, for them, by my Father which is in heaven. Given the current climate, this principle kind of makes sense. And this quasi-ecclesial language laid the foundation of the providential species of American exceptionalism, with its cult consensus of compromise and bipartisanship, and as well as also defines the ever elusive ideal of national unity of a chosen people. The signers were celebrated for accomplishing a miracle of overcoming the rancorous and factious politics to create, as David Ramsey put it, in a day, a nation of citizens. The autograph collection were also driven by the fascination with the handwriting. In the culture, they need to be a kind of a cultural history of signature, because it combined the view of the handwriting as a god's unique endowment that reflected the character of its owner, and a quasi-scientific appeal of graphology. The latter consideration actually rendered the content of the autograph almost irrelevant. It doesn't really matter as long as it's written by a famous person. Especially in the digital age of deepfakes, of course, the autograph acquired an additional value of authenticity, material authenticity. Collecting historical autographs has also been driven, on one hand, by the sense of what Seth Kotler calls cultural nostalgia, an impulse to hold on to the relics of the rapidly retreating past, but on the other hand, the fascination with the past's endurance. Autographs, in a way, are relics that were connected living to the dead, and the very language of the shared experience of writing, a letter, a shopping list, an IOU, what have you, a note. It's a kind of offered a comforting feeling of not dissimilar to the tabloid tropes that stars are just like us. The founders, they're just like us. The collecting of signers was also propelled with the fascination, with almost the magic of affixing one's signature to a historic document. It not only carving one's name in the nation's history, but also making a mere piece of paper into a founding chapter. In this respect, the signers appeared as the successors of the barons of Magna Carta and the heirs of the signatories of the Mayflower Compact. Of course, everybody who ever visited Nara in Washington knows the altar-like setting kind of confirms this quasi-scientific reverence for the founders. There was a particular genre of signers, or peculiar to the signers. It's the obsession with collecting a complete set. In a way, it's the obsession to complete something, a collection of something, is rarely attainable when it comes to books and specimen. But with the finite number of founders, this obsession could be relatively easily satisfied. So there were 4 complete signers. Excuse me. There were 4 complete signers of sets of signers assembled by Thomas Addis Emmet. 3 of them now reside at New York Public Library, and the 4th is at the Huntington. I think that the Huntington set can be used as a useful case study that sheds curious insights into the history of modern historical private collecting. And I just want to finish the very long introduction by highlighting the difference between the private collecting and the collecting intended for public consumption or public mission. The private collectors were not necessarily driven by the pursuit of common good or public interest. Rather they follow their peculiar personal preferences, tastes, and sentiments. Especially interesting, those are thrill of the chase. That was a very important factor. William H. Lambert, one of the dean of Lincoln collectors, willed that his collection be auctioned off instead of placed in a single institution because he wanted to offer other collectors the same pleasure of hunting down desiderata and assembling their own collections. And collectors' idiosyncrasies often reflects in the content and the shape of their collections. So it also the collection of historical manuscripts, especially American historical manuscripts, also reflected individual patterns of historical imagination and patriotic pieties. Lyman J. Draper put it that collecting of the Revolutionary War required a kindling of patriotism, a sense of sympathy with the noble patriots of the American Revolution. Next slide, please. Oh, right. That was supposed to be the first slide. So sorry. Basically, this is my main points, especially that the issues that I try to cover. Next slide, please. Sorry, I forgot to forward this one. So Thomas Addis Emmet had all these sensibilities and spades and then some. Emmet collecting reflected his peculiar identity as a card-carrying member of transatlantic intelligentsia, and also on the other, what historian of Irish American nationalism, Howard Luce, termed transnational nationalism. Emmet ended up being a custodian of the family archive, which included letters of Thomas Jefferson. He wrote quite a bit on the Emmet family. They are multi-volume editions, which are fairly engaging read. Among other things, the family papers also had Jefferson letters, which I suppose probably might have sparked Emmet's interest in collecting. His collecting was also informed by a peculiar mixture of family pride, which combined American patriotism with the sensibilities of a Virginia slaveholding gentleman, the champion of Irish home rule, and an exponent of racialized nationalism that saw the Celt or Celt, an American, as superior to the Anglo-Saxon and Anglo-Saxon superior to the rest of the world. The Emmets were physicians, lawyers, poets, and politicians, basically your basic intelligentsia class. And Emmet's Irish identity was different from that of the immigrants who came to the United States in the wake of the famine. He was very proud that his Irishness was that of the Protestant ascendancy and the United Irishmen at the same time. His great-grandfather was a physician to the viceroyal household. Next slide, please. Next slide. Okay, Well, yeah. And his grandfather and namesake, Thomas Addis Emmet, was the founding member of the United Irishmen. One of his uncles was Christopher Temple Emmet, a poet of some renown, and another, next slide, please, was none other than Robert Emmet, the celebrated legendary Irish revolutionary. And Emmet took pride in the fact that his ancestors were part of the establishment who chose to leave their native country in pursuit of freedom rather than physical survival. Uh, in 1891, Emmet was elected as the president of the Irish National Federation, INFA, created for the advancement of home rule. They made no secret that he was elected by his name, for his name primarily, and also by the fact that he was the only Irishman who, in a quote, the only man of Irish blood in the country who could hold the position of president 12 hours without going for somebody's head. Even though he proved to be an extraordinary president, because under his leadership, INFA expanded into not only in the eastern seaboard, but into Midwest. He was able to enlist the support of the Catholic Church. He was a devout Catholic. And in 1910, Emmet was awarded the Order of St. Gregory. Next slide, please. Emmet wished to be buried in Ireland. His body was transferred to Ireland only under the Republic. And next slide, please. This is Glasnevin Cemetery in Dublin. And this is a close up of the plaque, which hails him as his name is a benediction among many people. And this this note is pretty curious, because he did this many peoples that he was benedicted among. Was also included the southern slaveholding southern class. Emmet's father was John Patton Emmet, who was appointed in 1822 by Thomas Jefferson as a professor of chemistry to the University of Virginia. And his father and the Emmet family was one of the first American Irish to settle below the Mason-Dixon line and benefit from and prosper from enslaved labor. And through his mother, Emmet was also connected to the Tuckers, Tucker family of Virginia. And as other science of the Southern slaveholding class, Emmet was educated in the Jefferson Medical College in Philadelphia. He became one of the most successful gynecological surgeons of the time. He did, however, owed his career to Marion Sims, the father of modern gynecology, infamous for his ethical violations in the treatment of Black and Irish immigrant women. Emmet actually combined a very interesting variety of Southern antiquarianism of the lost cause species and the Irish antiquarianism of the medieval, infused with medievalism. For example, he corresponded with Robert Alonzo Brock, one of the major Southern collectors whose papers were also held, the Huntington. He collected the Confederate medals, and the sense of the lost cause infused his focus on, inflected his focus on American Revolution. It was the sensibilities of the heritage societies, the golden age before the Civil War, when in this sensibility reconciled the interest in patriots and loyalists alike. Collecting for Emmet was a deeply personal endeavor. In contrast with Henry Huntington, he did not envision a popular audience. He did not even intend to part with his collections. He only sold it because there was some issues with his house on Madison Avenue, and he had to dispose of his collections for money. In 1896, John Stuart Kennedy, a prominent New York financier, bought a big chunk of Emmet collection and deposited it at what is now the New York Public Library. Emmet's favorite format was an extra illustrated book. The genre was ill-suited for public display. The extra illustrated book, however, became a rather desirable collectibles. In 1912, bookseller and publisher Henry Malkin acquired 12 volumes of Emmet's extra illustrated volumes. And next slide, please. And in 1922, all 12 were featured at the Anderson Gallery sale in December. All of them were purchased through the agency of the Rosenbach Company and sold to the Huntington Library, which they now reside. Next slide, please. The content of the catalog is actually pretty curious. For example, this is the extra illustrated volume celebrating the life of John Andre. Again, the British gentleman was as much of an interest as American patriots. And the next one, please. And this one is the set of the signers, which was cataloged as the extra illustrated copy of the 1865 edition of this book, which actually created the collective identity of the signers. Next slide, please. It listed all the inset autographs arranged by state. And the next one, please. Including, I actually included in certain animations, but I think they don't work. But in South Carolina, you notice there's Thomas Lynch, and in Georgia, at the bottom, Gwinnett. These were collected exclusively for their rarity. Both documents are fairly pedestrian, but without Lynch or Gwinnett, no collection of the signers was complete. Next one, please. And this is, yeah, they're the one. And this is what the Emmett signers look now at the Huntington Library. Yes, that slim volume next to it, The Life of Franklin, is the autobiography of Benjamin Franklin, which we also hold. So speaking of home pride. Next one, please. Each volume is emblazoned with Emmett coat of arms, which he actually appropriated for another Emmett, but that never mind. And his Ex Libris, which paraphrases the Bible, the Proverbs 6:8, go to the Emmett, thou sluggard, consider the ways and be wise. It's important to note that, however, that Emmett, unlike other grandirizers, avoided destroying book to create his own creations. Rather, he printed his own books or other book-like objects and used as canvas for his own collections. Next slide, please. So this is on the left what its Sanderson 1865 biography looks as it is, and on the right it's it's Emmett's production. It was printed by Emmett. It was an imprint. And it has nothing to do with Sanderson, as a matter of fact. It's more of a compilation and, as I say, a book-like object. Next one, please. And his so-called extra illustrated Sanderson also included his own essays on the Mecklenburg Convention and the history of the Declaration of Independence. Next one, please. Emmett's extra illustration is something peculiar. We normally don't pay attention to it because we're preoccupied with autographs. But I would make a case, would argue that the aesthetics of the extra illustration are very important. Some of them are fairly pedestrian, patriotic fare. For example, this very interesting version of John Trumbull's The Declaration of Independence. However, next one, please. There is some striking imagery in this, which is very medievalist. For example, this image of America, which appears to be custom made, appears throughout his collection. It has nothing to do with the patriotic values or Republican imagery. Next one, please. I'll just flash next a couple of images to illustrate the point. It more resembles a medieval manuscript or a Renaissance manuscript. And next one. There is even a kind of a traces of chinois aesthetics. And next one. This is my favorite. It's even some pre-Raphaelite, the medievalist images, the botanical, purely aesthetic botanical imagery, and so on and so forth. It has nothing to do with the text. It's purely aesthetic. So this is the last one. The illustration bear no relation to the text. They're purely aesthetic embellishments. It creates a quasi medieval illuminated manuscript, which brings us back to the language of the church. If the collecting historical record for public displays is a matter of public worship, a variety of public worship in the temple of science or public good, then what Emmett created was basically a private devotion, not unlike a Book of Hours, which it also signifies a very interesting uh, development when it's the antiquarization of American Revolution, when the history of the revolution becomes becomes tailored to fit particular medieval sensitivities of a lost causer, an Irish antiquarian, or even a so-called self-professed American patriot. That, of course, once deposited in the library, the Edison collection marks the process of privatization of symbolic space of public memory, which Terry Eagleton singled out as the sign of modernity. Of course, what we're doing now, once deposited in the library, it undergoes the reverse process of becoming part of the public discourse. And I think I'm done. Thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you, Olga. I want to apologize to Nora for misreading her name earlier. We are going to take a few minutes to field a couple of questions before we break. And it will go straight to the audience, I think. Are there any online questions or no online? Oh, John Pollack has a question.
Sorry. Morning, everybody. Thank you. Thanks to folks online. Hi, Nora. I know we're short on time, but I just wanted to try to pitch something out that you all might be able to say something to. Thank you for these fascinating talks about the wacky and wild world of the collectors whose stuff we look at, but we don't often think about their own complicated or institutional trajectories. And I think Dave's reflection started this train of thought in me, but I think it applies to others. I wonder if we could turn back to the framing comments of Karen, Emma, and Sean, and of course, based on Trio and Silence. And you all talked to us a lot about what's in these collections, and it's interesting, I thought, to think about, your collectors' biases, which you're all very well aware of, and their own silences. And I guess I'm wondering how, as institutional stewards, which you all are, you might help scholars to think about not just what's in, but what isn't in. You're all sort of doing that, and I heard it in your remarks, but I wonder if you had some more to say. Thank you.
I can start. Is this working? Oh, there we go. So sure, Saul Feinstein was very interested in high-level autographs. So when I talked to Joe Falcone, the librarian of the David Library back in the 70s, he said he was trying to talk Saul into buying things like account books or small collections that had like a run of letters instead of just one letter by George Washington. What he really wanted was that soapbox that I mentioned. So. But Joe always tried to get him to move into more like larger collections, and so that's the way I think about my collecting as well at the APS. I'd like to buy I've used the Saul Feinstein collection to buy a couple of account books of Revolutionary War veterans. Taking in it from there was a great one that came out recently from covered from the 1770s up through 1820. It's a great way to understand one Revolutionary War veteran's life over a long period of time. Saul was not into that. He was very much like a hero worshiper. Several of us used that sort of term along the way. And that's why I argued that the collection was just not as useful as that microphone, which gives us more. There's not very much about common soldiers. Saul thought about race, but he didn't collect it. Collect material related to race, although there is some in it. That was not a sort of thing that he thought about in terms of his collecting. So yeah, there's a lot of gaps. It's a huge problem. So hopefully with the acquisitions budget we have now, we can start to fill some of those. Yeah.
Nora or Olga?
Yeah, there's one point about the hero worshippers, that they collected everything. It didn't matter the content. So, for example, our collection of George Washington, which was collected by Gerald Kane, includes a note clearly collected for autograph value, which enumerates his enslaved people in Dismal Swamp. Obviously, the collector was not interested in it. He was preoccupied with the autograph. But this attention to unpacking what previously was overlooked is part of basically it all goes through the genre of cataloging record. My colleague Melissa Haley presented a superb paper yesterday that describes our process, and all of this will end up in the cataloging record or in the finding aid. But it's important to note the context of the collecting, and as I say, making it public again. What was collected as a private piece of memorabilia becomes part of the public discourse through the cataloging record and the finding aid and occasionally conference paper.
Yeah, thank you so much, John, and hi. I think for an organization called Thomas Paine National Historical Association, the hero worship part probably speaks for itself. But in terms of the collector's silences, I think the only thing I would add, and again, I'm talking to sort of a material text person, right, is that because there is so many gaps in the provenance itself, right, the institutional records have these kind of silences about where things came from. So there is inadvertently the sort of collectors, I think, with the best of intentions, in some ways are replicating the same critique that they were trying to fix with Paine, right? That Paine, there was misinformation about Paine, there was a lack of clarity about him, rumors began about him, right? Gaps in our knowledge sort of about his life led to his sort of enemies weaponizing him, right? So on and so forth. And the stakes are, of course, quite different in the collection itself, but there are these sort of silences because we don't know about some of these items and where they come from, where you're like, oh, it gets into sort of a how would you, when it comes time to hopefully make the collection as publicly accessible as possible, how do you, how do you situate it? How do you describe it? How do you consider it? So I'll just stop there, but thank you.
Thank you. All right. We're going to call it a wrap. Thanks to everyone for your attention and to our presenters. And we'll continue in 15 minutes, I think. Okay. Thank you.